Good evening. Good evening. All right, that's better. My name is Jeffrey Trezak, and I'm the director of the Newark Public Library, and I'm here to welcome you to the second annual Philip Roth Lecture. Tonight's a very special night for us. Not only are we going to have a thought-provoking lecture by Robert Caro, but we're also sharing this lecture for the first time around the city by telecasting it, not just here at the library, but also at 5 of our branches located throughout the city. I want to offer a special thank you to Hans Decker, president of the Community Foundation of New Jersey, for your generous support for the lecture. And I also want to thank our Board of Trustees, and in particular our President, Tim Christ. They continue to support and encourage programming such as this evening's lecture. So I want to ask our trustees to please stand. In your program, you'll find a card about the Philip Roth Personal Library. We're very proud here at the Newark Public Library to be the future home of his personal library, a tremendous addition to our special collections. And in honor of this generous pledge, the Philip Roth Lecture was developed last year to celebrate and hear from today's authors who write about American history in fiction and nonfiction. I want to say a special thank you to our Philip Roth Lecture Committee members who are here this evening. Rosemary Steinbaum, representing the Newark Public Library Board of Trustees. Ben Taylor, as well. Other members who were not able to be here this evening and who have expressed their apologies include Adam Gopnik, Nicole Kraus, and David Remnick. The committee has been selected by Philip Roth to recommend and select the guest lecturer each year, and we appreciate your wisdom and your guidance. We're also pleased that our neighbor and partner, Audible, is offering Mr. Caro's On Power as a free download through October 31st in celebration of the lecture this evening. So please visit audible.com/Caro. A few housekeeping items. Time permitting, we will have a Q&A session at the end, and there are blank index cards and pencils on your seats. Please write your question clearly and hand it to a staff member who will be available to collect the questions near the end of the lecture. For those of you who are at our branches, your questions are also welcome. We're communicating with staff at each end to receive the questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Joel Canero. Joel has been a tremendous supporter of the library, and we're tremendously grateful for his support. But most importantly, one of the benefits, I've been here since February, one of the benefits of moving to a new institution is that you have an opportunity to also make new friends. And I'm very pleased to say that in addition to being a tremendous supporter of the libraries, Joel has become a very good friend to myself and my husband Michael as well. So with that, Joel, can you please join me and provide the introduction?
Thank you, Jeffrey. And let me wish you many, many wonderful and stimulating years in this marvelous library. And let me offer a belated welcome to New Jersey, where Philip Roth, of course, grew up in Newark, where Ina Caro grew up in Trenton, where I grew up in Mountain Lakes, and where our speaker went to college at Princeton. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I got to know this library during Philip Roth's 80th birthday, and I feel very much at home here. It's almost like a home away from home. And I'm honored to be asked to help celebrate 2 extraordinary writers who happen to be very close friends. Philip and I go back more than 50 years. We were young teachers together at the University of Pennsylvania, and have remained friends ever since. I've known Robert Caro somewhat shorter amount of time, but still 30-plus years, and we didn't meet at Penn. We met at an award ceremony he spends a lot of times at award ceremonies because he wins so many prizes. I was on the jury for the National Book Critics Circle, and I got a call from one of my colleagues, Joel. I have just read this extraordinary book about the early years of Lyndon Johnson called The Path to Power, with 100 pages about bringing electricity to the hill country. Doesn't that sound interesting? Yes, I said, that really sounds interesting. And then I read the book, and of course, I found that Brigitte's enthusiasm was, if anything, understated. The book won, and what I happen to know was a unanimous vote, the National Book Critics Circle Award, which it won, and Bob Caro won that 2 more times. He has won all of the other major prizes, often more than once, 2 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 National Book Awards, the gold medal of the American Academy. If you Google Bob Caro's name, you will see a long list of all the other awards. I won't go into all of them. When you Google, you find all sorts of interesting things. I found out, for example, that when he was a senior at Princeton, his senior essay about Hemingway was so long that the next year the department established a page maximum for I know that in addition to his various awards, Robert Caro has been honored, as was Philip Roth, in the White House by a president who reads books. And Barack Obama has said that when he was a young man, 22 or so, he read The Power Broker, which is Philip Roth's, rather Bob Caro's first book about Robert Moses and the fall of New York, and he said it influenced his political philosophy. Now let me give a bit of avuncular advice to this marvelous-looking audience. If you have not read The Power Broker, don't even think of picking it up if you've got anything you've got to do for the next few days. And I mean anything, sleeping, eating, reading the paper, Rachel Maddow, just don't, because I guess that's an oblique way of saying it's a pretty terrific book, and it is indeed. Now, Philip Roth and Robert Caro are such consummate masters of the English language. I feel a little bit like, well, like singing I Did It My Way in front of another New Jersey boy, Frank Sinatra. So as a result, I've decided to abandon prose, and I'm going to present the rest of my comments in a genre that I feel a little more comfortable with. So here goes, wish me luck. Just a handful of books of extraordinary length are as riveting as they are long. There's Homer, of course, Proust, Ben Taylor's man, Tolstoy. You really can't go wrong with a writer who grabs your attention and holds it for hour after hour. And the question I ask is, what is the art that creates this addictive power? What is the craft that causes one to say, as they do in old Dublin town, I picked this book up, and I found right away I just couldn't leave it down. Well, thus I approach a prose master whose name is, of course, Robert Caro, and I, of course, am not a poet, just a dear friend, Joel Canaro, who has read every word that this eloquent fellow has written, impressed, full of praise, much, much more than that. OMG, it's so great, I am smitten. For one thing, his tireless, unquestioned research could hardly be any finer. And he's blessed to engage as a colleague and spouse his luminous missus, that's Ina. Folks, could we have a hand for Robert Caro's one-person research team, Ina Caro? And the prose. Caro writes with an angel that he took from the wing of an eloquent angel, who blesses each word, every page, each summation, as he shows us the use and abuse of raw power in our gun-crazy, power-mad nation. An archivist born with the eye of an artist and blessed with the ear of a poet. His stamina, that of a marathon man. Does he tire? We never would know it. His prose never failing, our painstaking guide leads us slowly and carefully through to a new understanding of dramas and traumas that we thought that we already knew. He offers a sense that is tragic of power's impermanence and fragility, how it slips from control of a man's all too often human and less than heroic ability. With Shakespearean insight, he gives us a leader whose enemies learn how to fear, a Coriolanus of the Panhandle, a larger-than-life Texas Lear. I have long held the view that when Caro became our nation's most honored historian, the world lost a writer whose fictional heroes close readers could very well glory in. Was ever a character more brilliantly formed through novelesque metamorphosis than the hero of Good Neighborhoods, Bella's bad boy? I refer, of course, to Bob Moses. And here I have a fantasy, the broker of power on Broadway one day, a big, splashy, star-filled musical. The script, Robert Caro. The score, Stephen Sondheim. The critics will all wax enthusical. Scott Fitzgerald proclaimed in the US of A, our lives are without second acts. Scott was wrong. After Moses, the LBJ years come in four, count them, four massive tracks. The path to power, then means of ascent, then master of the Senate, and then the stunningly brilliant passage of power. Does it get any better than that? Really, can it? Thanks to painstaking prose in the earlier volumes that show how he gained his vast power, the way Johnson used it as president will come forth as the man's finest hour. Caro weaves in the threads, both the dark and the light, and the dark ones are more than a few, but his purpose is not to find fault, as he says, but to make sure the facts are all true. And so, Robert Caro, most eloquent friend, like Weequahics Philip, a craftsman of power, I salute two great artists, and now let's raise a shout as we welcome the man of the hour, friends of the Newark Public Library. Here is the man who gets all of our votes every day, Robert Caro.
Well, Joel, that was such an unusual and wonderful introduction that I'm reminded of what Lyndon Johnson used to say every time he got a particularly wonderful introduction. He used to say he wished his parents were alive to hear it because his father would have loved it and his mother would have believed it. The way things go today in America, if you're a writer, you seem to spend a lot of time giving speeches. But for me, no matter how many I give, I still feel more at home behind a typewriter than I do at a lectern like this. In fact, every time I get up to speak, no matter how many times it is, I feel like the young rabbi, Jewish like me, who's just gotten out of rabbinical school, and he's assigned as an assistant rabbi to a major congregation, and the senior rabbi, after a few weeks, says, next Friday night, you're going to give your first sermon. He says, I have to tell you, I get awfully nervous when I speak in public. Do you have any advice for me? And the older rabbi says, well, you know, you're allowed to have a water glass up there on the pulpit with you, and I find it helps if I fill it with a very dry martini. So the young rabbi gives the sermon, and after it's done, he hurries to the back of the synagogue, and he says to the older rabbi, how'd I do? And the older rabbi says, well, I have 3 comments to make. One, when I told you you could fill that water glass with a dry martini instead, I didn't mean you should leave the olives in it. He said, second, I suggested that you sip it at crucial points in the sermon, not drink the entire thing in one huge gulp at the beginning. And third, David slew Goliath. He didn't beat the shit out of him. I'm going to talk tonight about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to start by talking about the Mississippi Voter Registration Project of 1964, the project that would become known to history simply as Freedom Summer. In the spring, just before that summer in 1964, a group of 200 college students, men and women, came to a college in Oxford, Ohio, Western College, to take a rather unusual course. It was a course in how to keep your temper when people are shouting epithets at you, nigger lover and the like, getting more and more worked up and standing closer and closer to you in a menacing way, right in front of your face and shouting at you. It was a course in how to keep your temper while you're defying the white and colored signs at a soda fountain, for instance, ketchup and mustard are being poured on your head from the angry mob behind you to mix on your face with the spittle that's already there. It was a course in how to protect yourself when you've been knocked down and people are beating and kicking you. Their instructors taught them that your most vulnerable spots are your head, your neck, and your groin. Women who had gone down to Mississippi earlier that year had reported that a specialty of the jailers there was to beat them between their legs with belts. And they taught them what's the best thing to do when you're knocked down and people are kicking or beating you. You try to curl up with your legs together and your knees pulled up, and your arms and your hands protecting your head and the back of your neck. These 200 students were college students, mostly white, and they were volunteering to go down to Mississippi, where 45% of the population was black, but only 5% of the votes that were cast in an election were cast by black people. They had a pretty good idea of what they were heading into, and if they didn't, they were taught by their instructors, because these instructors had been to Oxford. The instructors would show the students their scars. They would show the missing teeth and other teeth that were just loose. They knew that 20 black churches had already been bombed that summer. So the instructors told them things. They said, don't wear contact lenses. Always carry a jacket so that you can wrap it around your head if you're attacked. And never, never be on the road at night. 3 of these volunteers, of course, were James Chaney, who was black, and Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who were white. On the very first day they were in Mississippi, they went to look at a black church in Neshoba County that had been burned down to the ground just a few days before, after a voter registration meeting had been held there. A deputy sheriff named Cecil Price pulled them over, took them to jail, and kept them there until 10:25 that evening, and then released them. So it was night. They drove away. Price followed them to a deserted area of the county, pulled them over, turned them over to a lynch mob, which shot Schwerner in the head, made Goodman walk over to the same spot in which he had just seen Schwerner killed, and then shot Goodman in the head too. Chaney, of course, was black, so they beat him to death. The bodies of the 3 men were buried beneath an earthen dam. And for weeks after that, as the search continued. The FBI flooded the state with agents, but nobody could find the bodies. And then they learned they were beneath a dam somewhere. So dams throughout the state they brought in bulldozers and excavated. Then an interesting thing happened. You see these headlines, bodies found. And then the headlines would say, or the newscasters would say, in a tone of disappointment, oh, it's not them. It's somebody else's bodies. So I remember a black man who had fought for voter registration before saying, yeah, it's like those bodies didn't matter. They were black bodies. They were the wrong bodies. Today, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, you say, has nothing changed in this country in all these years? I remember, in fact, when I was a young reporter, I just graduated from Princeton. I was working for a newspaper, Newsday, on Long Island. And my first beat was a series of towns. And what you did was you checked the police, among other things, you checked the police stations in each of these towns every night. And about my first week on the job, Northern Boulevard in Long Island, which was a busy thoroughfare, a man had run out into the street. He had been caught making love to another man's wife, and the other man followed him and shot him dead in the middle of Northern Boulevard. I thought I had a real story, and I went back and told the editor, and he said, wait a minute, is that black on black? Meaning, was it an all-black crime? I said, yeah. And he turned away, and he didn't want the story. And I remember thinking at the time, what does that matter? But boy, but all during the time when people were looking for the bodies of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, wondering that while throughout the country, and I still remember it, the dread deepened every week as the country realized that they must be dead. All during this time, more volunteers, more college students would go to Oxford for training. When they were done training and were ready to leave, there was a ritual. They would all line up next to the bus and sing "We Shall Overcome" together. Why did they do that? Because in a way, they said, if they sang it, they didn't feel so afraid. One of them said, finally we stood. It was the last thing, everyone. We crossed our arms, we clasped hands and sang, "We shall overcome." We sang it out together. We sang out all fatigue and fear. In fact, that became a verse that was made up that summer. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. So all that summer, the Mississippi Project went on. Eventually, more than 1,000 volunteers followed Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman to Mississippi. So in talking about civil rights tonight, I wanted to talk first about the Mississippi Voter Registration Project, because when we talk about civil rights in 1964, we're talking first of all about a group of heroes, people, young people who aroused the nation's indignation over civil rights, hundreds of them. Indispensable, what they did, heroic, hard to overstate their heroism and the sacrifice they made. But in talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that heroism can't be, in my opinion, all that we talk about. Because there had been moments before, many moments before, when the indignation of the whole country had been aroused over lynchings or some other incidents in the South. And there had been liberal majorities in Congress then too, and bills were introduced, civil rights bills were introduced then. But in all that time, none had passed. Really, you know, we talk about today this divide in Congress as if there had never been anything like this before. But in fact, that's not correct. What happened really was that Franklin Roosevelt, you know, the last major piece of social welfare legislation that Franklin Roosevelt got passed was a minor act that he got passed at the beginning of 1938. He never got another piece of major social welfare liberal legislation passed during his presidency. Harry Truman never got another piece of major legislation passed. Eisenhower, of course, didn't particularly want to get anything passed. And Jack Kennedy couldn't get anything passed. And the reason was very simple. There was a divide in Congress just as immovable and implacable as we see today. It wasn't a divide by parties. Today, it's Republicans, you might say, against Democrats. Then what you had a Democratic Party which had a big majority. But the positions of power in Congress were all held by Democrats who were Southerners. I forget, and I may have the wrong year, but I think in 1964 there were 16 great standing committees in the Senate, and the chairman of 11 of them were Southerners. And they had learned that if they were united with the Midwestern Republicans, the Republicans who gave lip service for civil rights with their lips, but in their hearts they were really against civil rights, that they could, by relying on procedural things that you couldn't rush legislation or you had to put it in a certain committee or whatever, they could control Congress. A liberal Senator, Paul Douglas, once said that he just got to Congress, and when he walked in the door, he saw the leader of one of the leaders of the Southern Democrats, Harry Byrd, who had been chairman of the Finance Committee for about 30 years, and Robert Taft, the leader of the Midwestern Republicans, sitting together at the center aisle, marking off how each senator voted, and he realized where the power was then. So between 1938 and November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated, no significant social welfare bill had passed Congress, and that was 25 years. As for civil rights legislation, no major civil rights bill had been passed since 1875. One had been passed, in fact, by Lyndon Johnson when he was majority leader in 1957, but he had to weaken it so much to get the Southern votes that it didn't have much significance. So no strong civil rights bill, no meaningful civil rights bill had been passed since Reconstruction in 1875. So in talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is necessary to talk not only about the heroism in the South, but how the bill got through Congress when no strong civil rights bill had gotten through Congress for almost 90 years. And that means we're talking about how Lyndon Johnson, the new president, got it through Congress. John F. Kennedy had introduced the bill, a strong bill, in June of 1963 with a very moving speech. But when he was assassinated on November 22nd of that year, 5 months later, that civil rights bill had been stopped dead on Capitol Hill. You know, from the first time I thought of writing biographies, I never thought of writing them. I was never interested in writing a book just to tell the life of a famous man. I was always interested in trying to use the life of a famous man to illustrate the great forces of his time, particularly the force that's political power, because I came to realize, or came to think I realized, that political power shapes all our lives. So when I wrote my book on Robert Moses, I didn't really think of it as a biography of Robert Moses primarily. I thought of it as a study in urban power, power in cities, not how the power in cities, not the power that we learn about in textbooks in high school and college, but the real, raw, naked realities of what power really is in cities. After that, I wanted to try to do national power, and I picked Lyndon Johnson. And looking at his passage of that act, learning first, because I had to learn it, and watching how he got it through Congress really provided me, and I tried to make it provide my readers, I don't say that I did, but this is what I tried to do, to look at a very specific and rare form of national political power. Because to see Lyndon Johnson in action, passing the Civil Rights Bill, is to see a skill at passing legislation that was beyond just skill, to see a talent that was beyond just talent, to see something that was really genius. You know, the life of Lyndon Johnson is in many ways, to me anyway, a very poignant life. A big part of him was this terrible insecurity over his impoverished childhood, young manhood, and in particular, his lack of education. He was very aware that he had gone to Southwest Texas State Teachers College, a tiny little school in a very isolated part of the remote hill country. He called it himself, he said, I went to the poor boys' school. If you were in Texas and you had enough money to go to the University of Texas, you went to the University of Texas. If you had almost no money at all, you went to Southwest Texas State Teachers College. He could turn it into a joke. He used to say at his cabinet meetings, there are 8 guys from Harvard here and 1 from Southwest Texas. But it wasn't funny to him. This insecurity was so deep that sometimes it's hard even to write about it without feeling like crying yourself. You know, when he was majority leader, he went to a NATO conference in Paris. He had never been to Paris before. And he was very reluctant. He was reluctant to go out of his hotel room because he was afraid he would make a fool of himself. When he went to a formal dinner there, he had brought his speechwriter, another poor Texas boy named Horace Busby, along with him. And Busby recalls how Johnson, sitting near the head of the table, would glare down at him the length of the table to make sure that Busby wasn't using the wrong fork and embarrassing them. And another event, he really just at the last minute decides not to go. And Busby is there, and a member of the French Senate comes up to him and asks, and Busby says he couldn't come tonight, whatever he says. And the French senator says, oh, I was so looking forward to meeting the greatest parliamentarian in the Western world. The greatest parliamentarian in the Western world, and he was really afraid to go to dinner. Looking at Lyndon Johnson passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, however, gives us a chance to understand exactly what that French minister meant. Johnson takes up the cause of civil rights 4 days after John Kennedy's assassination. On the next day, the 5th day, he has to make his first address, an address to the joint session of Congress. And he's not even in the Oval Office yet. He's still working out of his home. So 4 or 5 of his advisors are sitting around the kitchen table trying to draft his speech. And around midnight, Johnson comes down in his bathrobe and asks them how they're doing. They say, well, the only thing we're really all agreed on is that the one thing you mustn't do is to make a point of pushing civil rights in this speech. Don't make it a priority. He says, if you do that, you're going to antagonize the Southerners control Congress, you're going to stop your whole legislative program as well as civil rights. Don't antagonize them, they say. Don't make it a priority. One of them says, it's a noble cause, but it's a lost cause, and a president shouldn't spend his time and power on lost causes, no matter how worthy those causes might be. And Johnson looks at them and says, well, what the hell's the presidency for then? And in his speech the next day, he makes civil rights a priority, the first priority. He uses the word first. He says, first, no memorial, oration, or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of his Civil Rights Bill. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law. To write it in the books of law. That was a very important phrase to Lyndon Johnson, a very significant phrase. Lyndon Johnson saw part of a president's job as being a lawmaker, a legislator, a parliamentarian, someone who creates the statutes by which we are governed and live. When he first becomes president, of course, writing Kennedy's civil rights proposal into the Book of Law seems like a very long shot. Johnson had a great advantage going for him, the sympathetic atmosphere for the program that Kennedy's death had created in Washington. But sympathy for civil rights, majority opinion in the nation, majority opinion even in the Senate and the House, had collided before with the Senate's all-powerful Southern caucus, headed by the great legislator, powerful, racist, Richard Brevard Russell of the Russells of Georgia. And every time it had lost. The traditional graveyard of civil rights bill was Russell's Senate, not only because Russell was there, but because the Senate had the filibuster. In 1963, 67 votes were required to stop a filibuster, to impose cloture. 60 votes today, but it was 67 votes were needed then. And the fact was that you couldn't ever get 67 votes for cloture, not even once. Not once in the history of the United States Senate had a filibuster ever been stopped on a civil rights bill. And this bill, President Kennedy's civil rights bill, wasn't even in the Senate yet. The House, where it had been introduced, hadn't passed the bill and sent it to the Senate. In fact, the bill wasn't even at a stage in the House where it could be voted on. It wasn't being allowed to come to the floor of the House, so it could be voted on. The bill was still stuck in the House Rules Committee, the body that sends bills to the floor of the House for a vote. And there, in that committee, on the day that President Kennedy died, the bill was apparently going to stay for quite some time. The chairman of the Rules Committee was a gentleman named Howard W. Smith of Virginia. He was known as Judge Smith. He was refusing to say, even when the Rules Committee might hold hearings before it reported the bill to the floor. He had been chairman seemingly forever. He was a member of Virginia's Byrd machine, Harry Byrd's machine. Harry Byrd was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. They had controlled Virginia seemingly forever. And what Smith was really doing, and nobody seemed to realize it, was he was throwing up the roadblock that, in addition to the filibuster, would keep civil rights from ever being voted on. You know, these Virginians hated, it's hard for us, hated the idea of civil rights. They hated the idea of blacks and whites together. Harry Byrd couldn't contain himself when the Brown versus the Board of Education was passed. He says, 6-year-old children of both races will be packed into school buses like sardines. Can you imagine what will happen? Intermarriage, miscegenation. So they were determined to keep this bill bottled up. And what they were doing, and Smith's racism was of the same intensity. He viewed the Civil Rights Bill with true hatred, and he wasn't about to let it out of his House Rules Committee. On the day that President Kennedy was killed, in fact, Smith had still not scheduled any hearings on the bill. And that morning, the House Speaker, John McCormick, had asked Smith when the Rules Committee might take up the bill so that the House could vote on it. Smith told him, I don't know. The Christmas recess was almost here, Smith told McCormick. He said he would have to discuss the schedule of hearings with the members of his committee, and that he wouldn't begin discussing that schedule until the House reconvened in January. And he also said that he had no idea how long the hearings might go on after they did begin. So the Judiciary Committee had heard something like, I think it's 114 witnesses, But he said the Rules Committee had the bill now, and they might want to hear most of those witnesses again. And that was the situation on the day that President Kennedy died. That very day, the Washington Post had asked Judge Smith what plans he had for scheduling hearings on the Civil Rights Bill. His answer, which they quoted, was, "No plans." An interesting thing was that that statement didn't arouse any great outburst of indignation anywhere. That was just business as usual in Congress, business the way it had been for 90 years. There was just a general acceptance that although it was still only Thanksgiving, Christmas recess was around the corner, nothing's going to get done until after January. You may recall these phrases from the newspapers of our own time. Everyone was sort of resigned to the fact that there wouldn't be any more discussions about scheduling Rules Committee hearings until January. It didn't seem all that important, that delay. Christmas vacation was almost here. We'll talk about it after that. No one in Washington seems to see any significance in what Smith is doing. No one except the new president, Lyndon Johnson. One of his gifts, and it's a great gift, a rare gift, was for strategy on the grand scale. To see the whole picture in Congress, no matter how confusing that picture might be. And seeing the whole picture, he sees what the South is really doing. And he sees that what Smith is doing by delaying the hearings in the Rules Committee is a key part of that strategy. Because the strategy is simply delay. No filibuster can possibly be broken in the Senate unless the Senate has plenty of time, months, to do it, to let the Southern senators talk themselves out over a period of time. And the period of time to let them do that isn't, in fact, limitless, because each Congress is in session for only 2 years. A bill that has not been passed when that session of Congress is over has to be reintroduced in the next Congress to start the whole thing over again. So the end of this Congress was December 31st, 1964. But this Congress, as it happens, doesn't have until December 31st, 1964, because 1964 is a presidential election year. The Republican convention to nominate a presidential candidate, it's going to be Barry Goldwater, begins on July 12th. And the Republican senators aren't going to be in Washington, then they're going to be in the convention. 33 of the senators are going to be campaigning. They're up for re-election. They're not going to be in the Senate. The Senate is, for all intents and purposes, going to be done in 1964 on January 12th. So there isn't that much time at all. And what Judge Smith was doing was eating up that time. Seeing the strategy, Johnson sees also that the strategy is working. Judge Smith isn't saying that the hearings won't begin until January. What Judge Smith is saying is that discussions about when to hold the hearings won't begin until January. Smith, Lyndon Johnson sees, can't be allowed to do that. Because if Smith is allowed to do that, there simply won't be enough time to pass the Civil Rights Bill. Everyone is thinking in terms of 1964. Johnson sees that what's going to happen in 1964 is going to be decided by what happens in 1963, in November 1963, right now. He sees what no one else, at least no one on the liberal side in Washington, sees. And seeing that strategy, Johnson sees that it's working. If Judge Smith isn't stopped, if he's allowed to delay the bill like that, by the time the Senate finally gets the bill, there will be no time to break a filibuster and pass it. Why am I able to say that no one in Washington seems to understand this except Lyndon Johnson? Because we have the telephone tapes. And what we hear on the tapes sometimes is like a teacher trying to explain what's going on. And who is he explaining it to? He's explaining it to representatives. He's explaining it to senators. He's explaining it to newspaper publishers. He's trying to explain, for example, to Katharine Graham, who's the owner and publisher of the Washington Post, what's going on. We hear Lyndon Johnson on the phone begging Katharine Graham to let the public know what's going on. He says to her, this is his quote, "Smith's idea is that he'll run the discussions over until January." That's the discussions about the hearing. This is Johnson speaking. He'll run the discussions over until January. And then in January, he'll piddle along and get it into February. Then they'll have hearings in the Rules Committee until about the middle of March. And by the time they pass it out of the House, it will be Easter. And Dick Russell will say it's time for the Easter recess. And if Dick Russell doesn't get the Civil Rights Bill in the Senate until March, he will screw them to death because he is so much smarter than they are. The Senate will be able to filibuster it to death until it goes home, and there will be nothing done again. If we want to pass that bill, Johnson tells Mrs. Graham, we have to do it now. So Johnson sees what no one else sees, that if you want to pass the Civil Rights Bill, you have to get it moving now. He explains it over and over again. You really think, is it possible that no one else sees this? Certainly no one on the side of civil rights sees it. So Johnson sees the strategy, sees that it's working to keep the Civil Rights Bill from moving, and sees a way to get it moving. The only way. The only way is a maneuver almost never used, and almost never used now, called a discharge petition. A discharge petition is a part of the House rules where if a committee takes too long to release a bill, the House can vote, the whole House, to discharge the committee. That's why it's called a discharge petition, to discharge the committee from consideration of the bill and bring it directly to the floor of the House for a vote. This, as the New York Times wrote, is a procedure rarely invoked because it offends traditionalists to whom the time-honored House rules are sacred. The sacred powers of a committee chairman, never to be interfered with. As it happens, Johnson remembers that a young congressman, a liberal named Dick Bowling from Missouri, had in fact introduced a discharge petition some months before when Kennedy was president. But no one paid any attention to it. All the leaders, of course, were against it. This was against the House traditions, and it hadn't gone anywhere and had died. And even if he got the discharge petition somehow started up again, he'd never get the 218 votes that was needed. You needed a majority of the House to sign the petition to get it out of the committee. And while there were 257 Democrats in the House, 90 of them were from the South or border states. So to make the math, to simplify the math, you needed about 60 Republicans. The Republican leader was Charles Halleck of Indiana. Halleck was a very tough cookie and a racist. And when someone had asked him months before about a discharge petition, he said, "I've never signed one yet, and I don't intend to sign one now." And Halleck had done something further. This was a time of real party discipline. You didn't go against your party. It was hard on you if you did. And he had ordered the all the Republican members of the House not to sign a discharge petition. So Johnson calls Dick Bowling, who has been scared off really from pushing this petition. You just have to hear, Johnson says, yes, there's no sense in doing this, Dick, no sense in doing it at all. You've made a good fight. Then he says, Bowling, and then Johnson says, but Dick, do you see any other way of doing it? And Bowling says, well, no. The rest of the conversation is Johnson working Bowling up to reintroduce the discharge petition. And then he sets out to get it passed, to get the 218 votes he needs, which means he has to make everyone, the public and a lot of congressmen and senators too, understand that if they want civil rights, the thing they have to be interested in right now is not civil rights. It's a discharge petition, this rare thing called the discharge petition. He works on the Democratic leaders. He tells them the way to do it. He says, don't let your members say they're for civil rights, but they won't sign the tradition because it's against procedure. Make them understand if they're against the petition, they're against civil rights. Don't let them use the procedural excuse. But of course, he needs Republicans. He needs 60 Republican votes, which means he needs Charlie Halleck, the racist. But Lyndon Johnson is Lyndon Johnson. He doesn't just exhort people, urge them to do things for their better nature. He's Lyndon Johnson. He uses blunter weapons. He calls Charlie Halleck to his office. The largest employer in Charles Halleck Congressional District is Purdue University. Purdue University, as it happens, has built laboratories, aerospace science laboratories, hoping for contracts from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, but it hasn't gotten those contracts. So with Halleck sitting in the office, he calls the NASA administrator, a guy named James Webb, and says, I'm sending Charlie Halleck over to see you. And then he tells Halleck to go over. And when Halleck leaves the office, Johnson picks up the phone again. And he calls Webb, and Webb says, oh, I'll talk to Representative Halleck. I hope he'll be satisfied. Johnson says, you have to hear the tone in his voice. I don't think I can even do it. He says, hoping isn't what I had in mind. He says, if Charlie Halleck's not satisfied, I'll be talking to you again. All the next morning, no one understands why, but the New York Times reports all this morning, Republicans are leaving their committees to take calls from a party leader, and the votes are changed. So he gets most of the Republican votes, but he still doesn't have quite enough. He's up, if I remember, he's up around 190. He calls the civil rights leaders to his office. There are 5 great civil rights leaders. There's the oldest and most venerable and most, in many ways, to me, the most courageous of all of them, because he was fighting for civil rights for 40 years before this. A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Railroad Porters. Roy Wilkins of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Whitney Young of the National Urban League. James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality Corps. And of course, Martin Luther King. So Johnson's secretary, Marie Fama, says, should I bring them in as a group? Well, someone once said to me in explaining Lyndon Johnson's genius, Lyndon Johnson was the greatest salesman one-on-one who ever lived. And now Johnson says to his secretary, no, don't bring them as a group. Send them in one by one. And he doesn't just talk to each of them. He gives them a focus. The focus is the discharge petition. He says to them, I'll take care of the civil rights bill. He says, but you have to help me on the petition. He explains what has to be done to them. We've got to get, Roy Wilkins recalls his words, we've got to get the petition. The public has to be made to understand that the discharge petition is not just a procedural matter, it's a vote against civil rights. We've got to make people understand somehow that they either sign the petition or they're against civil rights. And they get it. Roy Wilkins, it's very interesting. Roy Wilkins had dealt with Lyndon Johnson for years, decades before. And he had this thing, he says, with Lyndon Johnson, you never knew whether he was out to lift your heart or your wallet. But Johnson, in this meeting, he's in his rocking chair, Johnson. Roy Wilkins is on one of the sofas in the Oval Office. Johnson has taken the padding out of the cushions of the sofa so that whenever as someone's sitting on the sofa, he's down further below Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson can lean over him. And he pulls the rocking chair over to Wilkins, knee to knee. And suddenly, Wilkins no longer feels that way about Lyndon Johnson. He says, and this is a quote from Roy Wilkins, I was, quote, struck by the enormous difference between Johnson and Kennedy. Kennedy was not naive, but as a legislator, he was green. He didn't really know what was possible and what wasn't possible in Congress. Johnson knew exactly what was possible. That's close quote. And he makes these leaders understand that nothing is going to be possible if Judge Smith isn't made to give a date for the hearings to start and to end. He says, I need votes. Wilkins says that he said to him, I need votes. I'll take care of the Civil Rights Bill. You have to help me with the petition. I need votes. It was too early to talk about getting votes for the bill. Without the petition, there isn't going to be a vote on the bill. So he gives them a focus. Martin Luther King is in many ways not only the great noble figure, possibly the most consequential American figure of the 20th century, but he's also, you realize from listening to these conversations, a very astute politician himself. He gives, and Johnson sees that, and he gives Martin Luther King a list of 5 names. There are 5 Republicans who have districts in which Republicans have won, although there's a very heavy African-American population in those districts. And Martin Luther King walks out of the office and says to a friend, it just might be that he's going to get where Jack Kennedy couldn't. So Roy Wilkins had felt with Johnson, you never quite knew if he was out to lift your heart or your wallet. Wilkins doesn't feel that way anymore. How do we know that? We know that from listening to another telephone conversation. It's a conversation from December 23rd, 1963, 10:30 at night. Johnson is still in the Oval Office working. He calls Roy Wilkins. He asks him for suggestions about what he's going to put in, what to put in the State of the Union address, which he has to give in 3 weeks. He asks him who to appoint to a Civil Rights Commission. He says he needs a Mexican-American. We don't have enough Mexican-Americans in positions here. Do you know one that we can trust? Wilkins gives him the suggestions. Johnson says goodnight, but Wilkins doesn't let him hang up. Wilkins says, now, Mr. President, may I say just a word to you? Please take care of yourself. Johnson says, I'm going to. Wilkins says, please take care of yourself. We need you. Civil rights doesn't have enough power to get those 218 votes. Who else has the power? Labor. Labor, who in the 1960s, Labor has the phone banks, and Labor has the field workers, and Labor has money. George Meany is the grand old man of Labor. He's the president of the AFL-CIO. George Reedy, one of Johnson's aides who knew Meany very well, said, you know what George Meany is interested in? He said this to Johnson years before. What George Meany is really interested in is recognition of his position. 2 days after the assassination, Lyndon Johnson invites George Meany to breakfast. He's still at his home. Meany comes to breakfast, and afterwards Johnson says, send your driver away. I'll drive you back downtown. As they're coming out through the gates of Johnson's house, he tells the chauffeur, stop, or the photographers are outside the gates. He tells the chauffeur, stop. he says, he rolls down the window, so all the photographers get a picture of George Meany sitting next to the president. From that time on, George Meany was in Lyndon Johnson's pocket. So there's Meany of the AFL-CIO, there's McDonald of the steel workers. Johnson, with McDonald, Johnson is very rough. He says, we're either going to rise or fall on that petition. He says, if you've ever tried, try. Oh, McDonald says, I'm trying, we're trying. We have lobbyists up on the Hill. Johnson says to him, if you've ever tried, try now. If we can just get that bill out of the Rules Committee, we've got to get 218. If we don't get 218, we fail, and if we fail on that petition, we fail on everything. The next day, McDonald calls back and says, I've got 33 guys working the House right now. Who else can get the votes? Clerics, clergymen, particularly clergymen from the religious Midwest, where the Republican Midwestern senators are from. And they've really been hard for Johnson to get. Johnson realizes that he's seen an item in the newspaper that the National Council of Churches has been meeting that week in Philadelphia. There are 4,000 clerics at that. He sends word to that convention. He says, don't go home after the convention. Don't go home directly. Stop by Washington. Go to see your representatives and senators. The New York Times reports, and the Times doesn't understand the significance of it, it says, for some reason, the halls of Congress were filled yesterday with clerics' collars. He says Negro and labor leaders are also streaming in. Anthony Lewis of the New York Times wrote, this is kind of quote, a dramatic change occurred on Capitol Hill yesterday. You could feel the mood shifting. Lewis says, President Johnson threw his full weight today behind the effort to pry the Civil Rights Bill out of the House Rules Committee. Smith doesn't want to be beaten. The vote Johnson has, he can count. Smith knows Johnson has 210 votes, 212 votes. He doesn't want it to get up to 218. That would be humiliating to have the vote taken away from him. He calls a press conference and he says, I know the facts of life around here, and surrenders. He announces that he's scheduling hearings early in January, and more important, he promises they will end in January. Lyndon Johnson has gotten the Civil Rights Bill moving. Now, there's a lot more to the struggle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than this. What I've been talking about is just the first step. There's a whole other fight before the Senate, which has a 57-day filibuster, the longest filibuster in history, before the Senate passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But you know what the importance of what Lyndon Johnson did with Judge Smith is? The date that the Civil Rights Bill is passed is July 2nd, 1964. The Republican convention begins July 12th, 1964. Johnson got it passed with 10 days to spare, with just 10 days to spare, by what he had done all those months before. There are a whole bunch of other heroes, Hubert Humphrey, Everett Dirksen, that are part of the civil rights story. And all the time, the roster of heroes, the black men and women, white men and women beaten, tortured, and sometimes murdered, is also growing on the streets of the South. And they're both required. But the struggle had, in particular, a general, a leader, a champion, whose overall strategy and day-to-day tactics were laid out and directed by him. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a story not only of heroism, but it's a study, a case study in presidential leadership. It's a case study of presidential power, of how a president can be a force for social justice, how a president can be a creator of social justice. So whenever I speak about Lyndon Johnson's and civil rights, I can feel compelled to say this isn't the whole story of Lyndon Johnson or of his presidency. The whole story is a very complicated story. There's another side, a side as dark as the Civil Rights Bill is bright. It's the story of Vietnam. The story I'm telling now in the next book has that story. In all, I hope of its deceitfulness, of all the deceptions he practiced on the American people. I will never send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. I hope I tell the story in all its staggering human cost. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Waist deep in the big muddy, and the big fool says to push on. 58,000 American dead, 350,000 seriously wounded. The amputations, men looking down at the space where their legs used to be. The blindness, the terrible scars, not only of body, but of mind. But the story of Lyndon Johnson is also the story of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Thank you.
What a wonderful presentation. My name's Jeremy Johnson. I'm pleased to be on the Board of Trustees, and I have the privilege of presenting you with our questions this evening, Mr. Caro. So we have some cards. Ladies and gentlemen, you were given some cards. They're in your bulletins. And if you give them to one of our ushers, they will certainly bring them over to us so we can make our questions known to Mr. Caro. All right. Number one, what makes your books endure? What makes your books endure? That's very simple.
Well,
softball question.
Thank you to whoever asked that question. I don't know. We all hope our books will endure, you know. But I'll just say I thank you, at least one of you, for thinking that they will.
All right, we'll keep it moving. How did you handle the controversy around the means of ascent?
About the what?
The means of ascent. The means of ascent.
How did
Yes.
I handle the
How did you handle
controversy
that
about
controversy?
means of ascent? Yes, that's a very good question. Means of ascent, for those of you who haven't read it, and the test is Tuesday, by the way. Means of ascent is about the election that Lyndon Johnson stole, really stole by with tens of thousands of stolen votes in Texas, and won finally by 87 votes out of 1 million cast. The controversy is that the person he beat, the governor he beat, was a governor named Coke Stevenson, who was very conservative and, to some degree, a racist. So the controversy was, how could you expose and make Lyndon Johnson look bad by showing how he beat a conservative? And why didn't you talk more about race and Coke Stevenson's racism? Well, the reason I didn't talk more about Coke Stevenson's racism is that in 1948, the year of the election, Lyndon Johnson's position on race, he hadn't changed yet, was exactly the same, almost word for word, as Coke Stevenson. So race wasn't, it was about an election, and both candidates had the same position. Was there any more about it? Is that?
Well, I'm going to thank you.
Yes.
This one has a New Jersey connection here. Would you speak about the contributions of Representative Peter Rodino, Newark's congressman, who was pictured in the front and center when the photo of the bill was signed? Peter Rodino, Congressman
Yes,
Peter Rodino.
Peter Rodino was a congressman from New Jersey. Johnson liked him because Rodino was a tough congressman, and Johnson liked realistic people. He liked Rodino, had him to the White House a lot. Yeah.
Oh, good for Jersey. If you were to write another book about a powerful figure, who would that be?
Well, that's the one question I think I'll take a pass on, because I do have one more topic, but I'm very superstitious, and I feel if I say it, I won't get to do it. So I'll take a pass on that one. That question.
Do you think LBJ would be an effective leader today?
Oh, that's another really good question. Do you think LBJ would be an effective leader today? And often people say he wouldn't be effective today. This is a different world. We don't have as much party discipline, or whatever. It's more television, whatever they say. But my answer to that is Lyndon Johnson was a political genius. At the time he passed the Civil Rights Act, no one thought anyone could get that act passed. The nature of political genius is that part of the nature of political genius is that it finds a way to do something in the particular circumstances of the time that no one else has been able to think of and to do. I don't know what Lyndon Johnson would do today, and I don't think it would be the same as he did then, but I do think he would find a way to do it, yeah.
Well, we understand your knowledge of the black leaders who came to Johnson, and the black leaders who came to the White House. You talked about Martin Luther King and the others, but how did you know the intimate details of that interaction? How did you know those intimate details?
Can you all hear these questions? Yes. Well, the quotes that I read you are direct quotes. They're from the telephone tapes. You know some of it from Roy Wilkins in particular was a terrific writer and described these scenes with Johnson pulling the rocking chair over to him as he felt himself sinking lower and lower in the couch. And so part of that, some of the quotes are from Wilkins' own book. Some of them are from these telephone tapes, which historians, they ought to be revolutionizing right now the study of history. We don't really have to wonder anymore, in many instances, what did somebody say? You don't have to try and picture what somebody says, paraphrase what someone says. You can hear what somebody says. So most of the quotes that I read you today were actual quotes of the ones with the civil rights leaders, actual conversations, like when he speaks to Wilkins on that Christmas Eve, and you can hear Johnson trying to get off the phone, saying, okay, thanks, good night, and Wilkins saying, wait, Mr. President, please take care of yourself. It's very, very dramatic, but also very real. Real meaning genuine. They're real. That's really what was said. Yes.
We know.
These are terrific questions.
Robert Moses, LBJ. What precipitates your interest in those subjects and your future subjects? Is there a particular moment? Were you inspired by a particular? That was one of the questions. What was the inspiration?
Well, there was a particular moment, actually. So I was a reporter for Newsday. I was whatever I was, 23 or 24. And I had become, by sort of an accident, I didn't know anything about what I was, an investigative reporter. And I was becoming more and more interested in politics. And Newsday, which is the Long Island newspaper, Robert Moses wanted to build a bridge from Oyster Bay to Rye. Robert Moses is across Long Island Sound. He built the Triborough Bridge, the Bronx Whitestone Bridge, the Throgneck Bridge. If he had had his way, he would have covered Long Island Sound with bridges all the way out as far as Long Island goes. And I discovered, wasn't hard, that this was the world's worst idea. And as I recall, it would have required 12 more lanes just to on the Long Island Expressway just to handle the traffic. All the traffic from New England would have come down to this. And the bridge would have had to be so big that the piers, the things that hold up the bridge, would have had to be so big that the tidal flow in Long Island Sound would be disrupted and would have caused pollution there. So the paper then, it was the belief in journalism that the way to get a Pulitzer Prize was to show some accomplishment. And the paper wanted to show an accomplishment. So they sent me up to Albany to make sure the bridge didn't get authorized. I knew nothing about nothing. But I talked to Governor at the paper because of its influence, got me an interview with Nelson Rockefeller, and who was the governor, he seemed to understand it was the world's worst idea, and I talked to his counsel who seemed to understand it was the world's worst idea. I talked to the Assembly Speaker, Tony Travaglio, who seemed to they all, and the president, everyone seemed to understand that. So I wrote a story saying the bridge, the Rye Oyster Bay Bridge, is dead. and I went home. And then I went on to some other assignment. About 2 weeks later, I had a friend in Albany then, and she calls me and she says, Bob, I think you better come back up here. And I said, oh, I don't think so. I think I took care of that. And she says, Bob, Robert Moses was up here yesterday, and I think you better come back up. And I still remember driving up to Albany from Long Island, walking into the press gallery of the Assembly chamber as the Assembly authorized the bridge by a vote of something like, I don't know, 148 to 2, you know. So I realized something at that time, which was that I'd won a couple of really minor, I believe me, minor journalistic awards, but if you're whatever I was, if you're young and you win a couple of awards, no matter how minor they are, you think you know everything about it. And I thought I knew everything about political power. And I realized in that moment that I knew nothing about political power, because underlying all my stories, didn't have to be said in the stories, was that we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, power comes from the ballot box, from being elected. But here was a man, Robert Moses, who had never been elected to anything. And he had enough power to turn an entire state government around. And he had had this power for 44 years, almost half a century. And I had no idea, and in fact, no one had any idea where he got this power. And that's why, that's really the moment. I remember driving all the way back from Albany to Long Island and thinking, boy, you're a schmuck.
We have a two-parter here. Have you seen the McNamara memos to LBJ recommending withdrawal in 1966-67? Have you seen those memos? And secondly, could you comment on the Ken Burns Vietnam series on PBS?
Well, I have seen the McNamara, but they don't quite do that.
They don't quite do that.
But what really happens in 1967, he says we're never going to win with the strategy that I, in fact, have been pushing on you for 4 years. I think the Ken Burns thing is a great thing. I think it's like a history lesson. I mean, it's hard to cram. People who ask me, you know, a television script, even for 10 parts, is like it's not this thick. And Vietnam is a very complicated story. So of course, I looking at it say, oh, he left out this, but the fact is that it's like a history lesson for the entire country. And you say tens of millions of people who have forgotten about Vietnam or never knew Vietnam are learning about it now. So I think it's wonderful.
And lastly, time for our last question. When did LBJ really get interested in civil rights?
That's a good question to end on. When did Lyndon Johnson really get interested in civil rights? Lyndon Johnson was always interested in civil rights. And how do we know that? When he's 20, I keep meaning to look this up. When he's either 20 or 21 years old, he's at this little college, Southwest Texas. And he has no money at all, and he has to drop out of school for a year to earn money to continue between his sophomore and junior years, this is. And he takes a job as teaching in what they called the Mexican school down in a little town called Cotulla, down near the Rio Grande. Well, about halfway between San Antonio and the Rio Grande. They call it the Mexican school, and these kids they weren't really Mexican Americans, they were the sons and daughters of migrant workers. And what I wrote in the book, in the first book, was no teacher had ever cared if these kids learned or not. This teacher cared. He believed that it was very important to them to learn English if they wanted to get ahead in America. So would get enraged if he heard one of them, if in recess through the open window he heard one of a boy shouting in Spanish, he'd run out and spank him. If it was a girl, he'd run out and yell at him. But the school board wouldn't give them equipment, volleyball nets, baseballs, bats. He persuaded the school board to do that. He persuaded the school board that they ought to have a debate team like the white kids had in their schools. but they wouldn't give him transportation. So what he would do is he would go to these little villages, really, of these corrugated tin shacks in which the migrant workers lived, and he'd persuade enough fathers to take a day off from their work in the fields, forfeit a day's pay, so they could chauffeur the kids to the games. So you really felt that this is genuine. Throughout his life, you see these flashes of emotion from Johnson on the issue of civil rights. There's just, to close on this one, see, that's why my books are so long. This will be my last anecdote. So he's just gotten to the Senate, and it's 1949, the Korean War. And a town called Three Rivers in South Texas is refusing to bury a Mexican-American veteran who was killed in Korea because he's in the town cemetery, because he's Mexican-American. So there's a moment, the head of a Latin American veterans organization sends a telegram to Lyndon Johnson. And it's opened in his office. We don't know, the two men standing together are John Connolly, who was then one of his assistants, later the governor, and Walter Jenkins. I don't know which one of the two opened the telegram, but they're both standing there with the telegram when Johnson walks into the office. We know this because I talked to both Jenkins and Connolly, and they remember this. And they hand him the telegram, and Johnson looks at it and says, without a moment's thought, "Then by God, I'll bury him in Arlington." And that's what he does. So you really feel this is a genuine belief in civil rights. Thank you all very much.
Well, this has been such a special evening for the Newark Public Library. We are grateful to Philip Roth for the planned gift of his personal library, for his support of this lecture series, and for suggesting that Robert Caro give tonight's lecture. And Mr. Caro, we are immensely grateful to you for taking the time to join us tonight and for your deep insights on the use of political power, drawn from decades of research and writing. How political power can be used for good, for all, how at its best it can be used to improve the lives of all citizens, especially those without power, and in particular how Lyndon Johnson used it to secure passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But I think we've also seen the expression of other types of power tonight, the power of personal stories, the power of thoughtful interpretation, and especially the power of having the gift of language, which Robert Caro has in abundance and which we have all benefited from. Thank you again. I'd like to take a moment to thank the staff of the Newark Public Library. They're all over here downstairs who organized this tonight. We have so many people here tonight as I look around, but I've been asked to recognize two in particular. Gwen Moten, the representing Mayor Baraka, and so active in the arts here. And I believe former Governor Corzine is here tonight as well. We invite you now to join us downstairs for conversation and refreshments. On the first floor, hors d'oeuvres in the James Brown African American Room, drinks and dessert in the lobby. Mr. Caro has graciously agreed to autograph books here in Centennial Hall, if you brought one, as the rest of us make our way downstairs. Thank you for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at future programs at the library and again next year at the 3rd Philip Roth Lecture. Good night.